Thank you for watching this video. My name is Felix Ritchie. I'm from the University of the West of England in Bristol. This is the third presentation in this section. First of all, we started with Sturgis Aedinis, who is discussing the problem of trying to identify public benefit. And he noted that the benefit that accrues to the public sector organisation that might be making those decisions is not necessarily the same thing as the public benefit that will be seen by the wider society. From that, he then argued that we should think about different models for defining benefit, ones which focus on wider welfare criteria rather than legal or particular organisational frameworks. Secondly, Francesco Tava discussed the difficulty of making decisions in a world where we have multiplicity of actors, increased distance between data collection and use, and where individuals take decisions without perhaps being able to see the impact of their decisions on themselves in the future or on others. He argued that models of solidarity, which emphasise a need for a common understanding of the goals and the burdens that accrue to each part of society, is the way to move forward and have a better, more robust decision making which does genuinely suit the wider society. So, this has both given us an invitation of a brave new world, something where we think that decisions are clearly made for the better improvement of society. Will it work? I'm going to think about how we might implement such wider, ambitious models. And to do that, what we need to do is understand how decisions are taken in practice. So I'm going to look at two elements. First of all, identifying the public interest, and secondly, acting on it. Who actually makes those decisions? So, in identifying the public interest, let's think first of all about a government department that might be, for example, have decided to improve the access to its data. So what might be some of the reasons for doing this? Well, one of the things that's often put about is leveraging data value. We've got this data, we've invested lots of money in collecting it. We haven't necessarily invested money to collect the data. We've invested money to carry out our services, but as part of that we've collected a large data resource. Surely there must be a way that we can extend the value from that. Maybe a public duty. Most government departments in the UK have something in terms of their mission statement about trying to improve access to that data for the greater benefit of society. There may be a requirement. It may well be that a more senior government department, for example, has said you're not doing enough on your data sharing policy, make it better, make your data more available. Or it could also be that we're plan to get useful policy results out of there, that we're hoping for research that will change the way we do our business. We're hoping for research that will make ourselves more efficient, that will improve our engagement with customers, that will do something to change the way that we work, and something that perhaps we wouldn't have found out if we did the research ourselves. So those would be the drivers for this. What would be some of the constraints on this? Well, most obvious one is cost. Either direct cost in terms of funding to do a new service, or redirecting resources away from things which staff are currently being allocated to. We might have the data. The thing is, we collect that data for our operational purposes. Repurposing it for data sharing arrangements is probably going to cost money, and that's money which is not perhaps part of my core objective as a department. There's going to be a privacy risk on there. Okay? I'm collecting this information. I'm not collecting it with consent. I'm usually collecting it through statutory frameworks. If I'm going to share that information, make it available to others, how can I be sure that the data is going to be safe and that the information which I've acquired and which I said I was going to look after is genuinely going to be carefully managed? I might worry about the potential for misuse. If I give my data to other people, what happens if they use it to prove that my policies are wrong or ineffective? What happens if they use it to look up their neighbour? There's lots of things. Once I start to lose control of the data and make it available to be shared with other people, I'm now taking that risk that usage might not be something that I would have approved. And finally, there might be reputation effects. people don't usually give data to government departments because they want to. They usually give it to them because they're required to, because it's for tax reporting, it's licensing your car, it's your health information. This information is collected under a form of duress. If you want to have this society, if you want to engage in society, you need to give us this information, and sometimes it can be under legal duress. If you don't give us information, you will go to jail. So if we're going to take the information which people are required to give us and then make it available, that might change the way that people look at us and might see, okay, not just something that's providing service, but actually something that is misusing my data, it's taking away, it's getting its own value out of this. This doesn't look like a government department which is neutral. This looks like a government department which is trying to extract extra value out of me. Okay, so we've got pros and cons. How might we want to balance those two? Well, one way we could think about this is, how certain are we of each of those? Let's put on a scale things which we think are either fairly certain or fairly measurable, things which are uncertain or unmeasurable. So one of the first things we think about is if we're required to do this. I mean, that's definitely certain. If you're told, government edict, all departments must take their data available, either open or through open access, unless there's a very good reason why not, that's fairly clear and measurable. Public duty, perhaps not quite so clear. There are mission statements, say, in all UK government departments which describe their use of data. And generally the idea is that data should be made available for the greater good of the community. But in terms of what that means specifically on the ground, it's quite woolly. I think about useful policy results. Now that surely should be something that's really important, but the trouble is it's very, very uncertain. You know, there's a lot of research that goes on. It's very rare that outside of medical research that a specific paper leads to a change in policy, for example. It tends to be the accumulation of research over time that tends to drive policy ideas. So although there is a relationship between research and data and policy and evidence and changing the way that we do these things, it's not a very simple one-to-one relationship. And lastly, leveraging data value. Everyone talks about this as it's important. We have no idea what it means. There are people in their studies who try to put on a value of reusing data, but all of them are pretty much finger in the air activities. We all think it's important. We have no idea really what this is, because to some extent anything you find from that depends on what you want to find. Okay, what about some of the downsides? How certain and measurable are those? Well, cost clearly is going to be one of the more measurable criteria. But also might think about privacy risk is something that's also relatively well known. And we have examples of things that have gone wrong, we have examples of things that have gone right, lots of statistical models, thinking about how people might use data. There are technical models thinking of the risk in IT systems. So we actually have a pretty good idea about some of the broad risk elements. What we don't necessarily have is a detailed sense of how those manifest themselves in any particular situation, but at least it's not completely working in the dark. Working in the dark, though, is probably potential for misuse and reputation effects. Now I have examples of, say, negative reputation effects. For example, when the HMRC lost its CDs containing highly sensitive information on child support claimants, that had a massive effect. But the trouble is with these things that go wrong is they tend to be one-off and unique, and so it's not clear how they manifest themselves on any particular situation. There was one survey a few years ago which asked UK residents, do you trust the government to look after your data? And overwhelmingly people said no. That same survey then asked people and said, should you carry on giving your data to the government? And the answer overwhelmingly was, yes, of course we should. People don't necessarily match up the two things, and one of the big problems we know from public engagement is that the way that the public views things is, or the response that they give to surveys, is very, very dependent upon the questions that you ask. Okay, so that's about certainty. What about benefit to the So again, let's think about things which are more of benefit to the department directly, more relevant to wider government society. So clearly there's a requirement as public duty. Those are quite closely related to the department's functioning. Leveraging data value is something which we want to see as a sort of broader government objective, as well as a specific value of the department. But for the department it's less important because, again, it doesn't tend to come through in terms of things like overall budgets. If you're making more use of the data, you don't tend to see a change in the value of the budget. What there is a broader sense that the government is being better about sharing its data. And lastly, useful policy results. Now, it might seem strange that I put this down as relevant to wider government society rather than being relevant to the department. And it is because, as mentioned before, policy research doesn't tend to have direct impacts. It tends to build towards a body of knowledge that changes opinion about things. And so that's why the policy outcomes tend to be very valuable overall in terms of thinking about what do we know about society, but they're often not specifically related to particular departments. Going back to the cost side, the negatives, or cost clearly is relative to the government department. Potential for misuse and reputation effects, well, you might think about potential for misuse of someone using the data to attack the department, or attacks being placed on the department by thinking about its reputation, given that it's sharing information which was acquired under duress. There's also, though, have a governmental aspect, because government tends to be seen as one indivisible thing. People don't tend to differentiate between different government departments. And so particularly when we look at the privacy risk on there, of the idea of thinking about, well, hang on, the data is just being shared without my consent, possibly without my knowledge, there is something going on here. And that is something that people will tend to think of, this is the government doing this. So overall, we've got out of this, we've got things that are important to the organisation. Pressure to do something, cost and risk of something going wrong. So that pressure might be internal, it might be external, but that's the tangible thing which is in the forefront of the organisation's mind. But balanced against that, though, is costs and the risks of things are going wrong. There are things which are also important to society, I say, particularly the value of the research use of data, and on a wider sense as well, the idea that there is better use of data across government, perhaps not just for research use, but also for operational use. These things are great. Trouble is, though, it's the organisation that's making the decision. And if you're looking at your budget, if you're looking at your public profile, if you're looking at your mission statement, this is what's going to focus your ideas. As Sergio mentioned at the beginning, there is a strong tendency for an organisation making decisions to associate the benefit to society with the benefit to that organisation. And here we're just going through and thinking about, well, why might that be the case? Why, given we have public sector organisations, they're not more public sector orientated? So that takes us through then thinking about the individual decision makers on here. So public sector organisations tend to be large, structured, highly procedural. They are what Weber called a bureaucracy, but in the pure form, philosophical concept of a large structured organisation where there are hierarchies and agreed ways of doing things. The average size of a central government department in UK, I think, is about 1,400 people. So public sector organisations are much larger than most private sector organisations, and it's in their nature that they tend to be quite hierarchical and have quite formal decision-making processes. They also have common training procedures and lots of ways of making decisions and lots of guidance on how to behave. One important thing is that they're able to fund any losses from the negative outcomes. Compared to, say, a private sector company, if a private sector company makes a bad commercial decision, it goes bust. If a public sector organisation makes a bad decision, it may have a large deficit on its account for that years, but the government doesn't go bust. It is recoverable. Finally, public sector organisations tend to be staffed by people who who are more likely to associate with societal outcomes. We did some analysis of the European Social Survey looking at the attitudes of individuals working in private sector and public sector organisations. And what you can see quite clearly is that individuals who work in public sector organisations, after controlling things like age, gender, family relationships, and also the country that this survey was taken in, generally people in the public sector tend to put a higher value on societal goals and a lower value on individual goals, and see themselves much more as part of a community. So what that means is that ideally our public sector organisations should be lovely, rational, risk-neutral decision makers. These are the best placed organisation to make their decisions. Yeah? You've got the funding to allow you to make rational decisions without worrying about financial constraints. You've got the structures in place to allow careful, clear deliberation of its use. And because you are trying to view this from a public sector perspective, then this should be more risk neutral than considering your own individual organisation's benefits. It isn't the organisation that makes the decision, it's the individual within that organisation. So let's take our civil servant here, making a data sharing decision. What happens if the data sharing decision goes well? Well, more likely, less likely. Well, what's probably less likely is the amount of kudos that people get. Might be kudos for the organisation for doing something which works really well. Might be kudos for the staff member within the organisation. Actually, the second one is probably the more likely, that you might get appreciated for having carried a project successfully to completion. But broadly, what's most likely is that no one really cares. Governments do things well. It's not a matter of interest to most people. Even those who are directly affected by these things. For example, I fill in the HMRC self-assessment tax form. I think is quite a nice, neat system, works very well for me. But at no point have I ever thought to write to HMRC and say, thank you for setting up a lovely online tax system for me to fill in. I expect them to do that as part of their work. And so this is one of the problems, is that the benefit from a decision that goes well is quite diffuse. Now let's turn it round. So what goes badly? Well, that's less likely. A calm review of decisions made and lessons learned. We'd all like to think this would what would happen in a world full of adults, but I can tell you from my extensive experience of working in and with the public sector that this is not the most common response. Particularly the more serious it gets, the more important it is to have a calm review, but the more likely it is you're going to have either a witch hunt and someone's career is going to die as a result of this. So, things go wrong, more likely to have quite a specific outcome for the individuals involved, irrespective of the fact that you have structured organisations, structured decision-making procedures, and all of that is designed to support individuals making their decision. We know that in practice, when it comes through, decisions tend to have diffuse benefit, specific costs if things go wrong, and that tends to focus people very much on what is the most defensive position that I could take. And there's a large literature which suggests that across many different countries, public servants find themselves under pressure to, rather than to do the right thing, to avoid doing the wrong thing. There are a couple of specific issues as well so for example, when I think about data access, there are a lot of different factors involved: IT, statistics, people management, operations management, law and ethics. These are quite specialist areas. For example, there's a whole group of people who just work on statistical disclosure control. There's a very a well-developed field in there, but outside that field almost no one knows what it does or what it's about, and yet it's crucial to data sharing. So there's a lot of opportunities for people to think, I got to make a decision on this and I don't really know about this, let's go and ask someone for their opinion on this. And that devolving that responsibility is fine if it's clearly agreed this is a shared responsibility, but unfortunately what quite often happens is you use this discussion with experts to devolve responsibility. You are the statistician. Tell me about statistical disclosure control. Tell me what I should do. Me, as a statistician, I then respond to that thinking, okay, here is my defensive response to make sure that this doesn't come back on me. I'm giving you advice, but I'm definitely making sure that my advice is something that if something goes wrong, this will definitely be the advice I want to be recorded as having given. So, as long with the general incentives to perhaps be more defensive, the nature of data sharing also makes it quite difficult for people to have a thorough command of all the elements that might be involved, and then to look to devolve responsibility, but in a way which encourages others to also make defensive statements. That leaves us quite a tricky situation, and what we often find is what we might call the path of least resistance. This is something which our final speaker is going to come back to, but I've spent a long time working with public sector organisations, different places, and so many times I've come across statements like this. I'm not convinced all the confidentiality risks have been assessed. This is said by the sort of person who says, okay, well, I don't know, I've heard the arguments, I can't find any counter arguments to them, so all I'm going to say is there must be something else that's wrong, and you haven't proved it to me yet. Unfortunately, this is a dead statement. It doesn't help us at all. It's not possible to prove that all the confidentiality risks have been addressed, nor would necessarily want to, because that ignores the benefit for doing things. But this is a fantastic way to basically put sound in the system and make sure that you're not seen as responsible for the decision. So, it can be quite a tricky process. We've now talked through, it's difficult for public sector organisations to see the wider public goal, because they are quite strongly incentivized to think about their own costs and benefits, and for the individuals within that organisation there's a very, very strong incentive to be defensive in decision making around this area. So one response to that, which we've been particularly pursuing over the last few years, is what we might call the ADRIAN Model: evidence-based, default open, risk-managed, user-centred. The idea here is what we're trying to do is change it from a defensive to a much more positive mindset. This is the default open. Instead of saying, I won't do anything unless I can do this, you're saying, I will do this unless there's a reason I can't. We use evidence instead of saying, well, what might happen? We say, okay, this is what we know is likely to happen, and we use that to make decisions. But particularly for this discussion, the risk managed and the user-centred aspects are important. Risk managed, being aware of the risk and looking across all the elements that fit together. Okay, what are the risks? What are the benefits? What are the risks of not doing something, as well as what are the risks of doing something? And most particularly, being user-centred, what is the ultimate goal? What is the public benefit? Because if we can't lay down clearly what is the point of any data sharing access, why on earth are we doing this? Okay, this should be our focus, is that working from what is the benefit, what are the risks and costs involved with this, let's work our way back to the implementation. And this is an institutional response to an institutional problem. Unfortunately, okay, how do we change institutions? Institutions change quite slowly on this. And we can do this by having finely honed arguments, but in the public sector, we tend to find that precedent is a much more important incentive. So, for example, if we think about statistical agencies around the world, now over the last 10 years or so, then there's been a very substantial change in attitudes to data sharing in there. And I have to say, a lot of this is driven by precedent, that some organisations have started looking at different ways of doing things. And because all statistical institutions work pretty much the same way, as each one has found a way of doing something, so another organisation has found a similar way, and they're following through. In contrast, some governments have been trying to go back to first principles, much as Sturgis and Francesco were talking at the beginning, and actually go through, what are we trying to achieve? Let's think about this from the ground up. And so in Australia, where they're going furthest at this, they have a very ambitious program of essentially trying to change the attitude across the whole of government. They're currently at the end of a 2-year process of consultation and moving towards legislation. And if this goes through, this will be an extremely impressive program, because it will have made a major difference to the way that organizations work. In summary, we talked a little bit at the beginning about the big concepts and the implementation of those concepts. How do we get them working? Because if we can get these big concepts, that would seem to give us lots of benefits, because we can clearly implement things more effectively. But a key element of that is the attitudes associated with these concepts. It's no good an individual having a great idea about how we can review public benefits, how we can think more communally. These are quite strongly associated to the attitudes that prevail in the community and in the organisations. And so changing those attitudes is going to be a key element to getting those institutions to change and to affect the implementation. But we know from where it does work, this can have quite a substantial impact on the outcomes, and it's a worthwhile goal, even if it's not an easy one.